I would say that I do identify as a European, not only because my passport says so, but because uh, Europe is a pretty remarkable continent, and a lot of the historical and cultural richness that Europe has is something that I feel very close to. The 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 aspects of the Enlightenment, the kind of cultural legacy of of kind of the music and the architecture and the literature and all these things that make Europe uniquely European, and something like Mozart, Bach, and the great philosophers and the great writers and the great thinkers that all shaped Europe to be the continent it is, make me feel a very close affinity to Europe that is beyond my passport and kind of the birthplace lottery, but it also goes to the fact that I feel a very close intellectual and philosophical and in a way religious connection to the continent of Europe and the kind of culture that came out of that. I was born in Belgium and then lived there for 17 years. And I was born in Antwerp, but then when I was three, my parents and I moved to the language border between Flanders and Wallonia, near Leuven and Wavre, essentially in between those two cities. And basically, on my side of the road, it was the Dutch-speaking part, and the signs and everything on the road and the shops were Dutch speaking on my side of the road, and on the other side of the road, everything was in French. And to me, well, first of all, that's pretty uniquely European. Is that you have, I mean, obviously other places in the world have that as well, but in my view, it's a very European and particularly Belgian thing to have these languages interact so closely together all the time, and this constant balance between the two. And as a result, I was able to go to school in Dutch for my primary school, and I learned Dutch that way. And then I was able to go to in French for my secondary school, and I was able to learn French that way. And then while I was at the French secondary school, I also learned German. So I was able to learn kind of these languages that are very European and that constantly mix together. I went to a football team where everyone spoke French and Dutch, and some even English or German. And so you had this constant mixing of cultures, constant mixing of languages, that shaped my worldview incredibly. Not only because when you learn a new language, you learn your horizon broadens, but you also tap into an entirely new culture. So because I speak Dutch, I can tap into the uniquely Dutch speaking culture, but then also because I speak French, I can tap into the kind of great French philosophers and writers. And because I know German, I can tap into the German art and culture and literature. And there's just something so uniquely European about that, that this formative experience of learning those languages in as growing up and constantly being exposed to people from different cultures and people from different linguistic backgrounds definitely shaped my worldview a lot. The primary thing is that because of how much I love Europe and because of how much I love the kind of cultural distinctions of individual European countries, it's been quite disillusioning to see the European Union move from what was a kind of strong economic union born out of necessity and kind of move towards a more closely political and in many ways an ideological union. And to me the problem there is that it erodes this idea of national sovereignty, this idea of each country being exceptional and unique in its cultural heritage and what it passes on to the next generation. And my worry with the EU becoming so political, and this idea of an ever closer union which goes beyond the economics but also to the culture and the ideology and the politics of it all, my worry is that that will start eroding, and already has been eroding, many of the things that make countries unique. What makes France unique is different from what makes Hungary or Poland unique, and I worry that the this trend towards an ever closer union will end up kind of amalgamating all these European cultures into one metropolitan kind of rootless culture that doesn't really have any distinct historical legacy anymore. So it's not really a particular moment, but it's a, I mean, obviously you had the treaties that kind of made that happen, but it was a general trend
If I
from
may
what was.
interrupt you very briefly, what would you say was a turning point towards that erosion of the European Union um, at
I
its
think I think there's a lot of idealists within the European Union that have for a long time behind the scenes been trying to move it from an economic union to a political union, and so you have some of the treaties like the Maastricht Treaty that have been trying to create that political union out of what was once an economic union. So I think that those are that for example that would be one turning point that that has made that happen. It's an interesting dynamic at my home because my father voted for Brexit and my mother works at the European Union. So my mother is American but became a Belgian citizen, and my father is Dutch, but they both live in the UK now.
okay.
And so my mother works for the European Parliament, and my father is just a freelance writer and journalist, and he voted for Brexit. And at the time of Brexit, I was very much against it, but I've come to kind of appreciate the arguments in favor of Brexit, and I would consider myself to be in favor of it now because of what I mentioned before about the importance of national sovereignty for each country to be able to determine its own laws and to be able to have that power over the direction it wants to set itself. And especially for a country like the United Kingdom, I think the EU in many ways is actually very restrictive, and it should and does have ambitions that are far beyond just Europe. And in many ways, Europe is quite protectionist and it's quite inward in that sense. And I think that this idea of a global Britain could really materialize once it starts striking free trade deals with countries around the world and starts leading in a way that it's not held back by the EU, but allowed to unleash itself in terms of innovation, in terms of business, in terms of global aid for other countries and things like that. So personally, I've become quite excited about the potential that Brexit could unleash. I would say the moment that was incredibly important for Europe was obviously when the Berlin Wall fell and when the Iron Curtain was lifted, and Europe was able to kind of move away from that division and towards a greater sense of solidarity. And I think especially for the Eastern European countries that were held under the grip of communism for so long, it was huge for them to be able to enter this liberal democratic framework. And so I think definitely the fall of communism would be and the fact that we were able to conquer communism would be the greatest recent moment in European history. So I was born in Belgium, but then I went to the United Kingdom to play actually professional football first, and then go to university. And it did tremendously help being able to have that freedom of movement to go to the United Kingdom and not have to worry about all kinds of visas and things like that, to be able to work and study there. So I think there is the EU does convey these benefits onto its confer these benefits onto its citizens in allowing them to have this seamless professional transition in any country in the EU, and for me that was personally very beneficial. So going off of my more recent answer, I would like to see the EU go into a return to that economic model of kind of a free trade bloc that will have this economic interdependency, but that doesn't necessarily require countries to sign on politically to this idea of an ever closer union. And sure, countries that want to do that should be able to do that, but I'd like to see the EU move away from that model and towards a model of more national sovereignty in terms of political and social and cultural terms, but also allow for this economic free trade that was so important for the continent to lift itself back up after the Second World War and throughout the fight against communism. So I think ultimately, if the EU doesn't do that, it will eventually unravel. And I think Brexit is just the beginning of that. And there are a lot of populist movements around the European Union that are risking, that are at a stage where they might also take a similar step as the UK did. And the reason for that is primarily because they feel like the EU has eroded this sense of national sovereignty and this sense of control over their own laws and their own culture and national direction. So I would love to see the EU just adopt a more hands-off economic approach that allows this prosperity to flow across the continent, but that also allows countries to remain true to their cultural heritage and their sovereignty. When I talk about sovereignty, the way I conceive of it is this idea of autonomy. Um, the problem with the EU is this kind of ever centralizing feature of the bureaucracy, of the central bureaucracy, and to the extent that increasingly major decisions are going to the European Supreme Court of Justice rather than to national Supreme Courts, and the EU is trying to impose certain cultural notions on countries that might not be ready for those cultural notions or that might disagree with them. And also, just one small example: the fact that in the United Kingdom, the fishing community has an incredibly proud history of kind of providing food for the country, and the idea that the EU kind of forced the UK's hand into allowing French or Spanish fishers to fish in UK waters, and then not allowing the UK to say no, these are our waters. We want to have control over our own territory. I think that's an erosion of sovereignty slash autonomy that I think people shouldn't have to accept. And if they don't want that, they should be able to say, we want to take control of our own rules and our own borders and our own the Supreme Court and all those things. I consider myself a conservative with strong classical liberal leanings. And when I looked at the environmental debate for a long time, I thought, well, I'm conservative slash classical liberal on everything except for the environment. I'm left wing on the environment, until I realized that there's actually, you don't have to, there's no mutual exclusion between identifying as a conservative and caring about the environment. And actually, conservatism has a very strong and powerful legacy of environmental preservation and conservation, especially in countries like the United Kingdom and the United States. And so I felt that there was just not enough. There was no seat at the table for students and young people that I knew agreed with me that they felt very uncomfortable with the current state of the environmental debate, primarily because there is this mainstream narrative that you have to be left wing to care about the environment, that all the solutions come from the big government, or for some people that we need some kind of socialism or overthrowing capitalism to be able to solve a problem like climate change. And having done my research, having learned about this, I learned that that's just not the case. Is that we can perfectly allow capitalism to flourish at the same time as tackling climate change. And in fact, I would go a step further and say that we need capitalism and the innovation and the scale that it brings to be able to solve a problem like climate change. And so I founded the British Conservation Alliance to give a voice to people that believe that and to kind of push back against the mainstream narrative. And it grew very quickly to over 40 universities across the UK, which makes it the largest formal environmental campus network in the country. We published a book called Green Market Revolution, which kind of outlined these pro-market environmental principles, and that's now being read in 93 countries. And we work closely with partners across the world. And I'm a director at the British Conservation Alliance, but I also work full time for the American Conservation Coalition, which is the U.S. partner organization. And this is a movement that's just starting to develop around the world. And increasingly, people are starting to realize that we need these solutions that don't ruin the modern economy, that don't sacrifice the modern economy in order to tackle a problem like climate change. And so it's very comforting to see this dialogue broaden and to see more and more people get involved in this from all sides of the spectrum. And at the end of the day, we want to be able to reach across the aisle and come up with solutions that work for everyone, not just for certain people on the political spectrum. Yeah, so I think the formative kind of time of when that started unfolding is around the original Earth Day in 1970. and environmentalism became this popular mass movement of people protesting in the streets, and it kind of moved from action, so like your hunters and your farmers and your ranchers and your fishers that were always considered conservationists, and it moved from daily action for the environment to a kind of brand of activism. And what happened is that a lot of students obviously got involved in this activism, and activism tends to be something that the left is better at than the right. And so you had this kind of reawakening of the left in the 70s, a kind of 68 generation and beyond, at the same time as environmentalism becoming a much more salient issue. And left-wing activists and politicians essentially started monopolizing the debate, and to an extent also um, making sure that they promoted all kinds of ideas within that would allow the right to or that would push the right and kind of even the center out of it. So the most recent culmination of that in the United States, for example, is the Green New Deal. And we see that actually the Green New Deal is not really about climate change. The Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's former chief of staff even admitted that. He said it wasn't originally about the climate. It's a progressive agenda to try and change the economy and society and all kinds of other issues, which is why it spends more time in the Green New Deal talking about things like healthcare or racial justice or federal job guarantees rather than climate change or the environment. And the problem there is that because climate change was hijacked into some kind of broader economic and social agenda, right-wing people, conservatives, started putting their heads in the sand, and they're saying, "Oh, if it's just all extremism, so actually the problem doesn't exist at all," because they saw this manifestation of extremism on the left, and they said, "Oh, then we have to come up with our own extremism to counter that." And so that's why you had this huge problem of climate denial for many conservative politicians, especially in America, and to an extent in the UK, but that's a lot less in recent years. And it's been this reaction to the monopolization of the debate by the left, and the right has basically stuck his head in sand and said, you can continue to monopolize this issue, and they've essentially not put forward their own vision for this. Now that's been changing, fortunately, with movements like the American Conservation Coalition and British Conservation Alliance. This idea that wanting to protect the environment, wanting to um, stop climate change, is about conserving what is good about our nature and what we want to pass on to the next generation, which is inherently a conservative principle. And so there's been this shift in the narrative that conservatives are starting to actually um, accept this idea that climate change exists and put forward their own solutions. Now, obviously, because of the traditional left-right divide, the left will look at the government as the entity that will be able to solve these problems, and kind of, again, the Green New Deal is this manifestation of, oh, the government just has to mandate that we need renewables everywhere, or they'll ban petrol cars, or they'll regulate carbon emissions, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that's happening on the right now is a response to this from a more pro-market, pro-innovation perspective that focuses more on how can we unleash the free market? How can we unleash innovators to come up with the technologies to solve a problem like climate change? Because at the end of the day, climate change is a technological problem. It's about having the same amount of economic prosperity that we have now without the emissions. But the only way you're going to get to that point, unless you want to send everyone back into poverty in a pre-industrial age, is to come up with the technological solutions such as carbon capture and storage, such as next generation nuclear, such as efficient battery technology for wind and solar, hydrogen fuel. The only people that will come up with this are innovators and entrepreneurs and businesses in the private sector that will scale that to become more efficient and to become more widespread in the society. And sure, there's some government role there in terms of creating a regulatory framework that's friendly to free market innovation, but also playing its role in investment in research and design. But at the end of the day, the emphasis is on how the private sector can take these solutions and scale them up and make them more efficient. And that's the kind of where the conversation is now, is the left is starting to accept also that we need innovation to get there. But the right is having this conversation about what's the best way to get the innovation there, and starting to come up with solutions that would unleash innovators, rather than just have the government control all of it. So the first thing that we'd have to say is that governments have been involved in energy policy for as long as we can remember, and the problem there is that they've completely distorted the playing field by subsidizing fossil fuels for decades, and even now we have $10 million per minute in fossil fuel subsidies that continue to distort this market. So obviously, from the get go, it's been very difficult for alternative energies to compete. Another issue has been the regulatory framework that has been created has been very anti-innovation. For example, nuclear energy is one of the best energy sources out there because it's incredibly reliable, and it's also carbon free, and it can create huge amounts of energy. And 60% of all clean energy in the United States now comes from nuclear. But constant new regulations and licensing requirements are pushing up the cost of nuclear to the point where it's just uneconomical for a private company to come up with a nuclear plant and to produce nuclear energy. There's studies that show that the great nuclear regulations that happened in the 70s, again, as a result of campaigning by left-wing climate activists, is that the cost of nuclear skyrocketed by 50 to 100%, whereas in a country like South Korea, it actually went down 12%. And the reason there is because they took a pro-innovation approach, and they have a ton of nuclear plants that are built at a very efficient and economically cost-effective rate, whereas we just don't have that in a country like the United States. So I would say that there's definitely been this anti-innovation approach through the regulatory environment and through the government picking winners and losers. And we need to return to this level playing field where these energy technologies can compete with each other. And just one good example of that is Texas. Texas deregulated its energy market, and consumers can choose where they get their energy from rather than having to take from a monopoly. And because of that, wind and solar have taken off in the state, especially wind. And if Texas were a country, it would be the fifth largest producer of wind energy in the world. And the reason that is because consumers can choose where they put their money, and increasingly they want to get these renewable clean technologies such as wind and solar. And so they're willing to go and reward that utility company that's creating wind power for the community. And so increasingly the consumer choice there is actually making a difference in a free and competitive market. So I would definitely say that there's been this anti-innovation approach with governments by picking winners and losers and excessive regulation. And one of the big tasks ahead is how can we unwind that to allow innovation to really take its route. Yeah, absolutely. It's outrageous that they've taken that approach of just denying the problem or failing to address it, and it's coming increasingly. It's starting to come back and haunt them because conservatives are going to lose more and more votes if they don't address these issues, and they absolutely should have, and they shouldn't have kind of fallen for the narrative that all you need is extreme government solutions, and they should have provided their own solutions a long time ago. And so I definitely think that there's a lot of responsibility that the conservative and classical liberal movement have to shoulder for their decisions on that. The generational divide on an issue like climate change is quite well known from polls, that young people tend to prioritize the environment and climate change as most often their top one or two issues. And older people are increasingly starting to also consider it an issue, but just not at the same rate as younger generations. But that generational divide is especially stark between younger and older conservatives. And that's what's really interesting, because a lot of these older conservatives are still kind of in that mindset of, oh, it's just a left-wing hoax or whatever, and they're not willing to address it. But young people realize that there's a problem, and young conservatives are increasingly accepting this problem and wanting there to be solutions. And so it's incredibly interesting to see that the generational divide is is not only just in general about the environment, but especially within the conservative camp. So essentially, you have to first point out that authoritarianism can be both left wing or right wing, because all it essentially means is greater government control over the economy or society or whatever. And the that fits, of course, perfectly into the kind of left wing environmental narrative, is that we need big government control to tackle an issue like climate change. And so obviously most young people are left wing, most young people care about climate change. So I'm not at all surprised to see them um, look towards greater government control, i.e. authoritarianism, as the best way of tackling environmental issues or climate change, because to them it is all about government control. Now, my pushback would be to say first, well, let's look at the countries that have been the most authoritarian in history, and let's look at their environmental track records. If you look at the Soviet Union, they destroyed entire ecosystems in the pursuit of industrialization. You had the Aral Sea, which is basically dried up. You have entire forests that were razed down for factories. For the same unit of economic output, socialist economies need 2 to 3 times more resources and carbon emissions. And if you look at a country like China, which is one of the more authoritarian countries in the world, they're also just building more and more coal plants. In fact, 72% of all new coal plants being built around the world are reliant on Chinese funding. And so, yeah, sure, an authoritarian country could force its country to stop emitting tomorrow and commit its population back to poverty. But the only way that you're going to come up with these solutions at a scale and technology necessary is by having entrepreneurs compete in a marketplace for the efficiency and for the consumer demand to make it happen. And you can also just put this into statistical evidence. There's something called the Environmental Performance Index, which is published by the University of Yale every year. And if you overlay that with the Heritage Foundation Economic Freedom Index, you see that the more economically free a country is, the more environmentally friendly they are. And so there's a clear correlation between liberal, free democracies and good environmental outcomes, and at the same time, authoritarian, anti-democratic countries and bad environmental outcomes. And so this is just a matter of people not realizing the evidence that exists out there that shows that authoritarianism really isn't great for the environment at all. Yeah, it's interesting to see that disconnect exists between people wanting to ban shorter flights, or they would prefer to have people take fewer shorter flights and take the train instead, but at the same time not being willing to pay more tax for that kind of thing. And so that shows that they want everyone else to not fly as much, or to not have shorter flights, but at the same time they're not willing to put their money where their mouth is and pay their own taxes that would be necessary to, for example, build more rail infrastructure. And so that just shows a kind of mindset where they don't think of all the economic aspects of tackling a problem like climate change. And the role that I see the European Union playing in addressing an issue like climate change is, how can we create a regulatory and economic framework and playing field that is as rewarding to innovation and entrepreneurship as possible. And the EU has taken pretty much the opposite route. It's taken an incredibly regulatory approach to things like biotechnology, which it all but banned biotechnology, which would be incredibly good for reducing carbon emissions. Ursula von der Leyen is saying that she wants to take a very heavy-handed regulatory approach to artificial intelligence, which is another one of those things that will greatly help in combating an issue like climate change. And
just very quickly,
and,
how does biotechnology and AI help tackle
yeah,
these
sure.
challenges?
So biotechnology is essentially the genetic tweaking of agricultural crops or animals, livestock, etc. And you could create, for example, meat, or you could create crops in a lab, and because of that, use fewer water, fewer land, fewer carbon emissions. And studies out there show that you could reduce the amount of land, water, carbon emissions, etc. by I believe up to 70 or 80%, because you're essentially relying on technology rather than very land, water, and carbon intensive agricultural practices. And again, it's technology that would come at the rescue there by allowing for the same amount of food and agricultural output, just without the impact on our resources. For artificial intelligence, that'll be extremely important when it comes to, for example, more efficient climate modeling, or coming up with other intelligent models to be able to find the best ways to reduce emissions in certain sectors, etc. And these are just technologies that are being developed. And what the EU is doing is they're essentially taking what is called the precautionary principles, because there might potentially be bad outcomes here, so we're going to regulate it to the point where it'll basically not exist. And that's extremely worrisome, because you're stifling the exact innovation that is necessary to tackle a problem like climate change. And I see similar things happening in countries in the EU when it comes to nuclear energy, for example, like Germany decommissioning all their nuclear energy plants. And so I think that the EU approach to kind of regulating and banning things, and at the same time picking winners and losers and spending a bunch of money on projects that they decide, rather than allowing entrepreneurs to follow where the market sends them, is not great news for the climate. I think a lot of people will start to appreciate the natural environment that is near to their home a lot more. So, I mean, for example, in the United States, you have a huge boost to hunting, because people realize they can go fly to Mexico or Europe or whatever it is, and they had to find these activities in their own backyard that they could do in the middle of a pandemic. And I know when I was in the UK during the pandemic, we went hiking in the local landscape, which is beautiful, and it gives you this newfound appreciation. So I think a lot of people will start appreciating the local nature more, and also realizing how valuable it is. The other thing is that we also have to recognize that the economic impact of tourism is enormous, and many European countries, like the coastal communities in Greece, Spain, Italy, France, and all over the continent, especially the Mediterranean, rely on this tourism. And I hope personally that it resumes as soon as possible, so that these communities don't have to suffer economically anymore. But at the same time, it's only by getting more income and by generating more prosperity for those areas that they can also generate more tax money, or more local money in the economy to spend on conservation projects. And a lot of tourists put an emphasis on going to that pristine beach in Greece, or that national park in Spain. And if there are no tourists going there, then those areas will lack the money to reinvest into the conservation of those beautiful areas. So I definitely think that there's a way for tourism to really help with conservation, and also to become more sustainable as these technologies develop, and ecotourism is something that's growing a lot, etc. as well. So I definitely don't think we should see tourism as the enemy, but we should look at ways to make it more sustainable. I do think ecotourism and the kind of understanding that there is this environmental impact of tourism has been growing, and it likely has been accelerated because of the pandemic. So people will likely be more willing to go to that resort or that hotel that promises to get its energy from solar panels, or that area that promises that every dollar in local tourist revenue goes towards conservation. I think that those things will be accelerated. And I know that countries like Costa Rica, which has a booming ecotourism industry, has been becoming a lot more popular in recent years, specifically because of the eco aspect of that tourism. So I do think that will be something that will a greater emphasis will be placed on that. I think it was already happening before the pandemic, but it's likely that the pandemic will have accelerated that. The second thing, for travel more generally, I think there will be a positive impact with the kind of whole Zoomification of society. So people realize they don't have to fly to Hong Kong for a meeting, but they can just have it on their computer from home. And I think a lot more meetings that don't have to happen in person will start happening digitally, and saving a lot of time, money, and carbon emissions that way as well. So That's one potential outcome that I think will be very positive. And also just people working from home and not traveling into congested cities anymore. Companies like Amazon and Twitter and Facebook are saying that their employees can essentially work from home as long as they want. And so if people are working from home, they're going to emit fewer emissions because they're not traveling to kind of the congested center of the city with their cars or whatever. So I do think that there will be some positive impacts for the environment that way.